In the depths of the night, a chilling tale lingers, haunting souls longing for a glimpse of darkness unspoken. Prepare to immerse yourself in the hushed whispers of horror as the shadows dance to reveal the spine-tingling secrets that lie just beyond our realm of understanding. Brace yourselves, for tonight the veil is lifted and nightmares become reality. Scott reclined on the sofa, skimming through the movie credits. When he reached the halfway point, he got up, stretched, and made his way to the kitchen. With his arms raised above his head, he opened the fridge and spotted a full container of juice. He sat on the kitchen counter by the window, cracked open the lid, and took a series of loud sips. Once he couldn't drink anymore, he gasped for breath and wiped his mouth with his hand. During the summer evenings, his life was uneventful. It was currently 9:00 p.m. on a July Saturday, and school was out for the holidays. His parents had gone to visit relatives by the coast and wouldn't return for another 2 weeks. Despite being invited, he declined to join them because he preferred spending the summer break with his friends in town. They trusted him to stay home alone as long as he kept the house tidy, which he was more than capable of doing. As he sat, he glanced outside into the garden to ensure there was nothing scary lurking in the darkness, but it was vacant and pitch black. He wished they had a pet, but their hair triggered his allergies, so his dad had vetoed the idea. At no-till, he returned the remaining juice to the fridge and went back to the window. He hoisted himself onto the counter and carefully surveyed the garden to confirm that everything was in its usual place. The bushes maintained their regular shape. 2 small trees stood together near the back fence, and a metal table with 4 chairs rested on the patio. He found comfort in checking these things, which is why the darkness did not frighten him. He would often investigate small noises in the night and preferred not to sleep facing the wall, as it allowed him to be aware of his surroundings. By doing so, he could potentially escape if someone were in his room at night. These habits quickly reduced his anxiety, as he either found the source of the odd noises downstairs or woke up to an empty bedroom. It is the uncertainty of what could be causing the strange sounds in the kitchen, on the stairs, or in his room that sends shivers down his spine. At 9:30 p.m, he got off the counter and walked back to the living room to turn off the TV. He decided to bring the remaining juice upstairs, so he returned to the kitchen and opened the fridge. However, he suddenly noticed someone standing in the garden when he turned his head to focus outside. In an attempt to not be seen easily, he closed the fridge door and turned off the light. He reminded himself that all the doors were locked and the neighbors were home. Despite this, his heart started beating faster as he strained to see the person's shape in the dark at the end of the garden, which seemed to be very still and a little thin, but he couldn't make out any other details. He returned to the kitchen window, taking a few seconds to adjust his eyes to the darkness outside. The back fence was not fully visible, but as he turned off the kitchen light and leaned on the counter, the other garden features began to gradually appear. Slowly, his previous mental image of the backyard was being confirmed. He was unsure of what he hoped to see, but eventually, he became certain that there was a figure standing against the back garden fence. He remained motionless. He stood there for 15 minutes, observing it intently. Although he couldn't discern its exact shape, it looked like a person. Realizing that he couldn't stay there indefinitely, he hurried upstairs, grabbed his laptop, and brought it back down to the counter with him. His friend Ben was online. Ben was going to visit him the next day, and they would camp in the forest and spend a few days in nature. Scott didn't want Ben to know that he was scared, but more than that, he didn't want to spend the first day of his holiday in fear and stress. So he hurriedly texted Ben and asked if he could visit him that night instead of tomorrow, and continued that he thought there was a tall and strange creature in the garden. Ben answered that he would be very happy because he was bored, and even if someone is in the garden, when he realizes that Oscar is not alone, he will leave. Oscar watched as the dark shape leaned against the fence, a full 10 minutes passing before the doorbell broke the silence. Opening the door, he was immediately embraced in a bear hug by Ben. Then he pointed worriedly into the darkness. Ben suggested that they go there together and check it out. The two slowly left the back door of the kitchen. As soon as he went outside, Ben saw the dark volume. He immediately pointed the flashlight in that direction, but there was nothing there. They turned the flashlight around and saw absolutely nothing unusual. They went back inside the house and locked all the doors. They both entered the house and locked the door before heading to his room. Oscar got out a sleeping bag for Ben and closed the curtains, avoiding a glance outside into the garden. To distract themselves from the garden, they spent a couple of hours discussing trivial matters before eventually dozing off. In the morning, he discovered that Ben's sleeping bag was empty. He called out to him and he replied that he was downstairs, so he quickly put on a t-shirt and went downstairs as well. "Did you sleep well?" he asked him. "Yeah, pretty well. I was thinking about our camping plans, and I thought it might be a good idea to bring the tent to his house. It would be a nice change, you know," he suggested. He didn't need to ask him why, because he also wasn't too thrilled about staying in his garden after last night. Wait a minute, last night? It occurred to him that the sun was already up, and he wanted to check on the garden while it was still daylight. He asked Ben about it, and after some hesitation, he agreed. They laced up their athletic shoes and ventured out into the backyard. To their surprise, there was no need for concern as the garden appeared vibrant and lively. The fragrant aroma of the plants and bushes that lined the perimeter of the garden filled the air. Somewhere in one of the small trees, a bird melodiously chirped, calling out to its partner. They made their way towards the back fence, but everything seemed undisturbed. Peering over the bushes in front of the paneling, they discovered nothing amiss. While Ben attempted to communicate with the curious bird through whistling, he took a final stroll around the entire garden. The warm weather made it an ideal evening for camping, he concluded. They had a conversation as they packed some sleeping bags and food into a couple of backpacks. They opted not to make a fire, so they gathered tinned hot dogs, bread, tomatoes, chocolate, and bottles of water. Ben told him about a nearby forest that was quite nice. He mentioned that he had camped there with his dad when he was 7 and how he felt like a hardcore mountaineer at the time. Ben chuckled at himself and assured him that if they needed more supplies or warmth, they could go to his house since his parents were out for their anniversary. He mentioned they would be staying at a hotel in the next town and would return in the morning. Leaving kids behind was a trendy thing to do that summer. They left his house around noon, carrying their 2 backpacks, sleeping bags, and tent, and headed towards Ben's house. His house was conveniently located in the same pleasant neighborhood. As they walked side by side, they engaged in lively conversation and shared jokes, exchanging nods and greetings with familiar neighbors along the way. The weather was exceptionally beautiful, with the sun shining intensely and the heat felt on their neck. The trees lining the sidewalk appeared radiant, their green leaves illuminated by sunlight filtering through. As they passed by a house, a sprinkler provided them with a refreshing burst of water, cooling down their arms. Despite only walking for about 20 minutes, Oscar was already perspiring. Due to the intense heat, they decided to skip entering Ben's house immediately and instead headed straight to his garden, where they left their bags in the shade. Ben had not exaggerated when he described his garden. Its gate directly led to an impressive forest. Towering, slender trees stood tall above the house, stretching as far as the eye could see. Some foliage and shrubs adorned the forest floor, but most of it consisted either of grass or smooth stretches of dirt. It was perplexing to understand how this forest was considered small. "Doesn't it look good?" he boasted. "It's amazing," he admitted, opening the gate and observing the area. He walked out through the trees and found a level spot for the tent. When he turned around to ask Ben's opinion, he paused, feeling a little disappointed. It didn't feel like true camping when his house was so blatantly visible. "Let's go a bit further in so it feels more authentic," he suggested and headed back to grab his bags. Ben objected to carrying his heavy stuff any further. They walked in a straight line from Ben's house, glancing behind them until the house was practically concealed by the trees in front. They hadn't gone far, but the forest was already denser and greener. There was even an old rope swing hanging from one of the trees. but it seemed too worn to hold their weight, so they decided to pass on it to avoid any injuries. With Ben's assistance, he set up the tent and they threw their sleeping bags inside. He laid down to test it out. The warm and humid air forced Oscar to adjust his breathing for a moment. Stepping outside again, he asked Ben if he had a flashlight for the evening. His response was, "I can do better than that," and he headed towards the house. Since he was too hot to chase after him, he opened his backpack and drank half a bottle of water before putting the rest back. He found a patch of grass to lie down on and gazed up at the canopy. Although he couldn't feel it, the leaves swayed gently in the breeze. Soon, he heard Ben returning and asked him if he brought a torch. Closing his eyes, he could see the red tint from the sun shining through his eyelids. He listened to the sound of his footsteps as he walked past Oscar towards the rope swing. He warned him that it might not hold his weight as he heard him tug on the branch, causing it to creak. He continued to tug a few more times, each time followed by a creak. Certain it wouldn't hold him, he smiled in anticipation of hearing a big creak and a snap from either the rope or the branch. He waited as he made some final tugs. Creak, creak. And he waited some more. Creak, creak, creak. He was startled by Ben's voice in his garden, causing Oscar to abruptly turn his head towards his house. He was running through the trees carrying a lantern. Looking in the opposite direction at the rope swing, he noticed that it was motionless with nothing around it. Perplexed, he walked towards the rope while questioning himself. He pulled on it gently, but there was no creaking. Growing more concerned, he pulled harder, yet the swing remained silent. He became anxious and jumped up to grab hold of it, forcefully pulling it down. The branch slightly bent as his feet touched the ground, but still, there was no noise. He continued to grip the rope tightly as he looked up at the branches, but eventually, the middle of the rope couldn't withstand his weight, and it fell with a soundless thud in front of Oscar. Ben approached, shaking the lantern in his hand. He's never used this before. His cousin gave it to him as a Bentmas present. She always gives him the strangest gifts. He didn't respond as he continued to stare up at the branch with half of a rope swing hanging from it. "Hey, are you okay?" Ben asked, following his line of sight. "I thought you had already come back. Someone walked past me and was messing with the rope swing." He immediately replied. He wasn't the type to brush things off with a casual response. Ben asked worriedly, "Where is he now?" "I don't know. I had my eyes closed, just lying there." Oscar replied and pointed to where Ben was, "And then I heard you shout. So I looked around and there was no one there." He started to feel a bit uneasy. "Look, calm down for a moment," Ben started. "It's the middle of the day. We're only 30 feet from your house, and even if it was a person, so what? This is a public woods. Anyone can pass through here." Ben's reasoning made sense, and he was right about it being a public area. But then where did they go? Oscar glanced around one last time, but the thick layers of trees made it difficult to see far. He supposed he must not have been fast enough to see who was there. "Okay," Oscar said. "Man, I can stay alone in the house for weeks on end, but I can't handle a short walk through the woods on a summer day." "That's why you have some backup," Ben declared, holding the lantern above his head, and they both laughed. They spent the day exploring the forest, and when it got too hot, they went back to the tent to get some water. While they were there, they chatted about school and their plans. Their conversation led them to discuss dreams, ghosts, and mysterious creatures that hide in the darkness. Although neither of them was easily frightened by these things, they made for interesting campfire tales. Ben shared a particularly captivating story about a woman with a cat's head who resided in the woods. If you heard her raspy meow, it meant she was searching for you. Once the mewing ceased, it meant she had found you and was swiftly approaching. The story sent shivers down his spine, and they decided to stop telling stories shortly after that. As the day turned into night and visibility became a challenge, they decided it was time to retreat to their tent. The intense heat of the day had suppressed their hunger, so they left the food aside, opting to eat if they felt the need later on. Hanging an electric lantern at the entrance of the tent, Ben switched it on, and to their surprise, it emitted a bright yellow light that illuminated the ground and nearby trees. The contrast between the warm glow and the darkness beyond was striking. After entering the tent, they found solace in the sight of inviting sleeping bags, as the earlier warmth had dissipated, and it had become too chilly for their light. Taking the lantern with them, they settled in for the night. As he strained to listen, he inquired, "Do you hear mewing?" Ben, with a grin on his face, replied sarcastically, "Yeah, I can also hear a bunch of nonsense." Although he had hoped to catch him off guard, he accepted his response and zipped up his sleeping bag. They spent some time conversing before the exhaustion of the scorching summer day caught up to them, and they drifted off to sleep. In his dream, they were once again walking to Ben's house, but this time the surroundings had changed. More trees filled the landscape, and darkness descended rapidly. As he blinked, night had fallen, the forest stretching endlessly in every direction. The rope swing loomed before him, but Ben was nowhere to be found. A creaking sound from behind sent a shiver down his spine as if he had missed a step. Strangely, he couldn't bring himself to turn around. Determined to escape this nightmare, he pressed forward, and soon the rope swing came into view again, confirming his realization that he was trapped within a dream. Slowly, the swing lifted itself into the trees and vanished from sight. Curiosity got the better of him, and he positioned himself beneath its former spot. Suddenly, a rustling sound above caught his attention, and as he looked up, a terrifying figure with the head of a cat hurtled towards him, its mouth gaping wide. Its sharp tooth grazed his left eye, jolting him awake in the tent, gasping for breath. Sweat covered his back, and Ben slept peacefully beside him, oblivious to his distress. The lantern still illuminated their surroundings, revealing their backpacks at the tent's entrance. Taking a moment to calm himself, he settled back down, but a thumping sensation in his head reminded him of the unsettling experience. Wincing, he reached for the water bottle beside him, quenching his thirst with a few gulps. The glow of the lantern made it difficult to fall back asleep, prompting him to sit up and search for its source within the tent, only to discover that the light was actually coming from outside. He called out to Ben, still groggy from sleep, asking about the location of the lantern. Ben mumbled a response before rolling over. Confused, he looked around the tent and realized that the source of light was coming from outside. As he contemplated the situation, he considered two possibilities. Either someone had entered the tent and taken the lantern outside, or they had forgotten to bring it in. The latter option seemed more plausible. He unzipped the tent door and peered outside, trying to locate the glow. To his surprise and unease, he saw the lantern hanging in the air, 20 feet above the ground. Goosebumps covered his body, and he quickly zipped up the door before waking. He woke up, confused by his urgency. He informed him about the lantern, but insisted that he had brought it inside. His reasoning faltered, and they both stared at the front of the tent. Feeling scared and uncertain, he suggested that they return to his house. However, Ben was unwilling to walk through the dark. Realizing that they couldn't stay in the tent indefinitely, they devised a plan. They would retrieve the lantern, leave everything behind, and spend the night at Ben's house. As children alone in the forest, while their parents were away, their fear grew stronger with each passing moment of inaction. He despised being the first one to venture out. He had an urge to retreat, even if that just meant lingering near the tent's entrance. Unzipping the tent flap, he surveyed his surroundings, but there was nothing to be seen. He peeked over the back of the tent, still nothing in sight. It was pitch black outside, except for the light. Stepping outside, he felt the coldness, and Ben, standing right beside him, expressed the same sensation as he glanced over his shoulder. Then, he turned back and noticed the lantern floating in the air. Their gaze was fixated on it, and the seconds dragged on. Eventually, he figured out which tree it was suspended from. The broken rope swing at his feet confirmed it. The lantern was hung high above their heads, tied to the end of the rope that dangled from the darkness. He couldn't comprehend it. It was too elevated for even a ladder to reach. The trees, except for the canopy of leaves, were thin and bare. leaving no climbable options. Gathering up the piece of rope that had snapped earlier, he coiled it and tied a knot, aiming for the lantern. Stepping back, he leaped and threw it into the air. It connected with the lantern, causing it to swing. As the lantern swung, it cast rocking shadows around them. At that moment, he regretted hitting it. The light caused the shadows to sway unnaturally, which instilled panic in him and brought tears to his eyes as fear gripped me tightly. Desperately, he grabbed the rope again and flung it at the lad. He missed, and the rope bundle sailed off into the darkness. Helplessly, he turned to Ben, who had already retrieved his backpack. He swiftly turned and threw it with a yelp, hitting the lantern directly. It plummeted and landed with a crack on the ground, but the light still remained illuminated. Hesitantly, he rushed over to pick it up. He looked at Ben and felt a rush of relief almost overwhelming him. "Let's go, hurry," he urged, and he began jogging towards his house with Oscar following closely behind. In the darkness, they moved with a mix of running and stumbling, constantly checking behind them and letting their imaginations run wild with thoughts of what he couldn't say for sure how much time had passed, but it became clear that Ben's house was not in the direction they were going. Frustration seeped into Ben's voice as he exclaimed, "Where is it?" Panic was evident in his eyes as tears threatened. He was likely no different, although he was too focused on the pounding of his heart to notice. "Okay," he said, taking a deep breath. They turned around, retracing their steps in a straight line. The thought repeated itself in his mind. What if they couldn't find the tent? As they walked, it felt like they were going twice as far, until finally, the light fell upon the side of the tent. They approached and stood next to its side, surveying its surroundings in search of the right direction to go. The silence felt eerie, like the calm before a terrifying event unfolds. The comparison made Oscar feel sick, and he tightly closed his eyes, sensing the hairs on his skin standing up. The throbbing in his temples indicated how hot his head felt. They couldn't determine where the house was. Only a 10-foot radius around the lantern was visible, with darkness enveloping everything else. Each direction seemed incorrect. Ben took the lantern from Oscar and examined their surroundings closely, squinting his eyes to see better. He remained where he was. "Ben, turn it off," he urged him in a hushed voice. "What?" he asked. He swiftly and silently moved closer to him, bringing his face close to his. "There's something in the tent." His gaze shifted past Oscar towards the tent, and he stood there staring. They were standing on the left side of the tent, and from this angle he could barely see the unzipped door hanging open, but he remembered leaving it that way, so that wasn't what made him clench his teeth. A few feet away, his backpack sat on the dry ground, with the food he had packed neatly arranged around it. Their sleeping bags were also precisely laid out, forming a path that led straight into the entrance of the tent. He took a cautious step forward, allowing the light to pass through the fabric more easily. It couldn't have been a trick of the light. Something large and dark was crouched there, its front facing the open door. He berated himself for not noticing it earlier. It remained completely still, not even seeming to breathe, just waiting for them to investigate the arrangement it had created. "Turn off the light," he whispered once more, but Ben remained unresponsive, absorbed in his thoughts. Desperate, he pleaded with him again, this time in a hushed tone. Suddenly, a voice echoed from the nearby tent, causing the tone was eerily slow and strained, resembling a parrot mimicking a new word. Its resonance sent shivers through his body, while simultaneously urging him to turn off the light. He heard the click of the switch, too loud in the silence, and Ben firmly grasped his shoulder. His hands clenched tightly in response, as he struggled between the desire to flee and the fear of staying put. His mind wrestled for control, while his legs remained rooted to the spot. Breathing shallowly, they stood enveloped by the darkness, only able to sense the presence of the tent. "Ben," a voice hissed, mocking his word. The thing inside the tent played with his vocalization, causing his stomach to churn with dread. Without hesitation, he grabbed Ben's hand and forcefully pulled him away. They sprinted aimlessly, their legs pounding against the unseen ground. Lost in the pitch-black darkness, he forgot their location and couldn't discern what lay ahead. Without warning, he collided head-on with a tree, the impact resonating painfully in his forehead. Brief flashes of light filled his vision as he stifled. It was excruciating, making it difficult to catch his breath. Though Ben urged Oscar to keep going, he collapsed to the ground, sinking onto his knees and emptying the contents of his stomach. As he lay on his back, his head throbbed and a trickle of blood stained his brow. Wiping it away, he attempted to gather his thoughts, but the agony overwhelmed him. "Wait, I can't," he begged, struggling to regain his composure. They stood together in the darkness of the woods, oblivious to their surroundings, unable to see Ben beside him. The darkness weighed heavily, as though his head was imprisoned in a suffocating blanket. They both remained silent as they waited, their breaths reverberating loudly in the air. He couldn't help but wonder how far the sound could carry. Slowly, reality started to sink back in, and the pain became more bearable. He straightened himself, desperately trying to make sense of the situation. The fear began to take hold of me again, sending shivers down his spine. He began counting silently in his head, and a minute went by with absolute silence. Not even the wind whispered, and the birds seemed to have vanished. Another minute passed, and he continued counting. 3 minutes. They were still alone. He questioned whether it was even searching for us. In the darkness, he reached out for Ben's arm, startling him when he made contact. But he assured him with his other hand, relieved that he still held the lantern. Having light on their side was advantageous if only they could utilize it. He hastily replayed the events in his mind. The lantern hung from a tree. They exited the tent, and then they became disoriented. When they finally made their way back to the tent, something had infiltrated it. But why did it take the lantern and not harm us while they slept? He remained silent for a brief moment and then whispered urgently, "Ben, we should turn on the lantern. We have to get away from here. We can run to your house, but we need to see." "No, please, we need to stay here," Ben whispered back, his voice filled with desperation. "Even if we have to wait until morning, we can't turn it on." He could hear the hint of a sob in his voice. "Just stay quiet. We have to, please." He opened his mouth to speak again, but then he heard it. A faint clicking sound, coming from somewhere in the darkness. It was almost too soft to hear, but it was there. The irregular, stuttering clicking, like nails on a wooden table, and it was getting closer. Click, clack, click. He strained his ears, trying to determine the distance. It was approaching. Then, suddenly, it stopped. For the first time, he was grateful that he couldn't see what was lurking in the dark. Maybe that meant they were hidden too. As his mind raced, he imagined the cat-headed woman, and it sent shivers down his spine. He was waiting to hear that mew, but instead, his ears were met with something entirely different. He clenched his throat, fighting back tears. He repeated his name, hoping to remind him not the voice, void of any meaning, echoed nearby, as if the creature was using random sounds to trap us in the darkness. Ben released his hand, and he heard his foot gently touch the grass behind him as he prepared to flee. Mentally, he pleaded with him to remain quiet. The voice softened and elongated his name, like a door opening slowly. As it called for him again, Ben let out a whimper. Motionless, he awaited some sign of what would happen next. The silence stretched on, and he held his breath for as long as he could, growing impatient. Slowly, he reached out and placed his hand on Ben's shoulder. Carefully, they lifted their feet, moving without making a sound. They retraced their steps, never halting, but with extreme caution. Time was irrelevant. They were determined to escape, even if it took hours for each step. Unfortunately, Ben accidentally bumped into a tree, emitting an audible gasp. Instantly, the clicking noises started, click, click, clack, click, reverberating towards them, growing closer. At that moment, he was at a loss for what. He closed his eyes tightly, attempting to suppress any screams. The clicking abruptly ceased, just an arm's length away. Silence enveloped them. Once again, the voice called for Ben, begging him to turn it on. Filled with fear, Ben quickly turned on the light and sprinted away without looking back. He stood his ground, fixated on the lantern, ignoring everything else. They didn't dare turn to look at the creature, but they could hear its presence. The sound of their footsteps on the grass was drowned out by the creature's scurrying claws on the hard earth. As he desperately ran to catch up to the light, the sound suddenly grew louder behind them, making him fear that it would drop down on them. He screamed for them to change direction, realizing that if they wanted to survive, they had to run for their lives. They veered off, causing the tapping sound to momentarily cease, allowing them to gain a few precious feet before it started again. His legs were cramping painfully and Ben was struggling to catch his breath. They couldn't keep this up much longer. He saw the light from the lantern stop abruptly ahead, but he didn't have time to stop. He prepared to collide with Ben, but to his surprise, the light passed beneath his feet. Ben had dropped the lantern. He turned his head and watched helplessly as the light faded away into the darkness. It was now too far for Oscar to retrieve it, and he knew that the creature would be upon him in a matter of seconds. He was running, wiping away tears and fearing that he would collide with a tree. Through his blurry vision, he saw an orange glow in the distance. Confused, he wanted to warn Ben to avoid it, but then realized it was just his legs felt heavy, but he pushed himself towards the light. Slowly, it became closer, accompanied by a clicking sound. Ben passed under the streetlight and disappeared, urging himself not to stop. He reached the edge of the forest and the ground beneath his feet became more solid. He noticed a row of streetlights leading to the right, with Ben passing underneath each one. He continued running, putting distance between them and the forest. Eventually, the clicking stopped, and he felt the need to check if they were safe. Looking back, he saw an empty pathway illuminated by the lights. He kept jogging, fixated on the glow, expecting something to appear at any moment. However, all he saw was concrete and the roadside. He repeatedly asked himself, "Is it there?" as he desperately searched for any sign of it. While trying to catch up to Ben, he suddenly spotted something pass under the first street light. Confirming his worst fears, he let out a cry and hurriedly ran, determined to reach safety. The image of the creature was seared into his mind, although he only caught a brief glimpse. It was enormous and white, barely missing the streetlight as it passed beneath it. The creature had a long, upright body that seemed to unfold itself, but he couldn't make out any distinct features. He knew it must have had a face and limbs, but he didn't have time to see them. Without looking back, he continued running, and soon the path became illuminated by more street lights. The glow of house windows indicated that they were near his house, which was a small stroke of luck. With increasing panic, he shouted, "My house!" And Ben turned left onto a side street, rushing forward. He reached the intersection, looked down the road, and saw Ben jumping the fence into his back. "Hurry up!" Ben yelled, urging Oscar to catch up. He quickly climbed over the fence, scraping his elbows in the process, and his ankles stung as he landed in the garden. Sprinting towards the kitchen door, he fumbled with the key and eventually managed to unlock it. Ben stepped to the side, gasping for breath, as he rushed inside. They slammed the door shut, and he locked it from the inside. Then both of them raced upstairs and barricaded themselves in the bathroom. Panic-stricken, Oscar whispered, "What was that? Did you see it?" His mind was in turmoil, wondering if the creature would find a way in. "No," Ben replied, crouching under the window, tears streaming down his face. "Damn it. It was so tall, I couldn't see it." He struggled to express his terror. "Please, don't tell me about it," Ben interrupted, unable to handle any more detail. As they sat in the bathroom, minutes slowly turned into hours, but his mind continued to race. Oscar could still hear the creature's repulsive voice, and his bloody elbows and forearms reminded him of the intensity of the situation. They both stared at the floor, occasionally sobbing. Their hearts pounded in their chests as they spent the night in that fearful state. The sunlight flooded in through the window, but it wasn't until noon that they finally unlocked the bathroom door. They tiptoed downstairs and found the kitchen door still locked and the house devoid of any signs of life. He peered out the living room window and saw another beautiful day. Although no people were passing by, the sound of sprinklers and birds chirping provided some comfort, helping to ease their nerves. "I guess that tent can stay there," he finally said. "Yeah," Ben agreed. They spent the entire day in the living room with the TV off, feeling lost and uncertain about what to do. They contemplated whether they should call the police. Time seemed to drag on as they struggled to gather their thoughts and figure out their next steps. His mind was consumed by thoughts of what had just happened, leaving little space for thinking about the future. When it finally turned dark around 9 p.m., the phone rang. Ben's parents were on the line, worried about him and asking if he had seen him. They had just returned from out of town. He reassured them that he was okay and asked if they could come pick them both up from his house because something had happened. They wanted to know more, but he told them they would explain everything once they arrived. They said they would be there soon. A wave of relief washed over them knowing that adults were on their way to help fix everything. They would believe them. They had never lied about such things. Even if they were skeptical, they would at least believe that there was some dangerous animal in the forest, which was enough for them. Oscar walked into the kitchen to grab some juice from the fridge and realized he hadn't had a drink all day. He could hear water dripping in the sink, so he tightened the faucet and gulped down some juice. As he made his way back to the living room, the sound of water tapping started again. He turned on the light and realized it wasn't coming from the sink or anywhere in the room. It sounded like it was coming from a distance. He looked out into the garden and barely made out a blurry, tall figure leaning against the back fence in the darkness. The tapping sounded more like clicking. Slowly, the figure moved away from the fence and clicked its way across the grass toward the house. Oscar whispered no, please no.
Brave souls, don't miss out on new horrors lurking in the shadows. Hit that subscribe button and stay tuned for bone-chilling thrills.